All right, I'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to see all of you here today to join us for this book talk and conversation. First, I'd like to thank the Center for Jewish Studies at Berkeley, especially Etta and Jennifer for helping make arrangements for today, as well as the Magnus for hosting us here. There are many reasons I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Deborah Dash Moore and David Henkin to discuss Professor Dash Moore's most recent book, Walkers in the City, Jewish Street Photographers of Mid-Century New York. I should note that Deborah Dash Moore is the Frederick G.L. Hutwell Professor of History at the University of Michigan, where she is also affiliated with Judaic Studies. She's the author of numerous books and articles, and I'll mention just a few. As with her latest book, her first book, At Home in America, addressed second-generation Jews in New York. And from there, she also worked on other urban histories to the Golden Cities, looking at Miami and LA, GI Jews, Jewish military service in World War II. She's returned to Jewish New York in both edited collections and others. And finally, we have her most recent book, Walkers in the City. David Henkin is the Margaret Byrne Professor of History here at UC Berkeley, and he too has written about New York as well as other spaces. His first book, which I'll talk about more in a moment, City Reading, looked at antebellum New York, and from there he's also written about the postal age as well as the week, and has forthcoming work on both baseball and voting. These short bios tell us about their roles, affiliations, and books, which are important. But there are, I think, far more interesting connections between these two scholars, and are the reasons I brought them both together today. They are both urban historians with deep connections, both scholarly and lived, to New York City. Both grew up there, albeit in different neighborhoods, and admittedly at slightly different times. But more interesting to me is the overlap in their scholarly work on cities generally, and New York City in particular. Both are fascinated by how we see and read a city, and even more so by how historical actors have seen, read, and understood their urban homes. Walkers in the City asks us to walk with ordinary people, with mid-century Jewish street photographers, those who, in the age of smaller and lighter cameras, roamed the city, taking in and capturing urban public space. They looked down, they looked up, they looked around, they looked ahead. And in so doing, they created an archive of what Dash Moore calls vernacular images of city life. Indeed, the chapters of Walkers in the City center on verbs, on reframing, looking, letting go, going out, waiting, talking, and selling. And in his first book, City Reading, Professor Henkin also investigated how New Yorkers, albeit antebellum New Yorkers, encountered the public spaces of New York City. His work also centered on verbs, or at least one verb, reading, in public space. But it wasn't the reading world of high literature. Rather, it was the space of the vernacular city. He writes of the world of promiscuous circulation, the visual culture of imposing commercial advertisements, incendiary political broadsides, hackneyed parade banners, cheap daily newspapers, and devalued dollar bills. And it's this intersection of seeing and reading, of encountering public space in vernacular and ordinary ways, and thinking about circulation of people, spaces, of eyes. Indeed, if we look at the cover image and the image projected here, really this emphasis on how we see and how historically people have seen. In addition, both have paid attention to the gendered nature of public space and the ways in which people joined organizations or affiliated with others and how that shaped the way they too saw the city. So with that, I thank you all for joining us and look forward to this conversation about how they're both walkers in the city and how they all saw the city.
So, thank you, Professor Stopps. As just mentioned, I come at a fascinating book like this with all kinds of shared intellectual interests with the author, and so I'm as eager as you all are to hear this project reconstructed and elaborated. But I wanted to say, and I would say this to any audience, that the striking thing about picking up this book is to be reminded of something that we don't ordinarily think of, not in the history of New York so much, and certainly not related to our shared intellectual interests in public space, but simply about the history of photography. Right? Pick a book like this, and you're suddenly reminded of the fact that so many of the canonical photographers of 20th century America, I would have said, happened to be Jewish. Right? So not just famous modernist photographers like Alfred Stieglitz or Paul Strand, but quite popular ones as well. Richard Avedon, Gary Winogrand, to Ouija, Diane Arbus, Bruce Davidson, Annie Leibovitz. I mean, really, it does seem to be a Jewish art of sort, and all of those, by one definition or another, are also New Yorkers. So this book has lots of intellectual agendas, but one of its perhaps unintended consequences, though it's one that Professor Dash Moore engages, is to think about what difference it made, at least to the photographers, to be New York Jews of a certain era, and I think we're going to hear a bit more about that. Within the book itself, a couple of provocative theses are offered by some of the protagonists. I think it's Naomi Rosenblum, the author and historian of photography, who sort of women's photography, who sort of dismisses the observation with the thought that no, we were leftists. Those who had studied in the New York Photography League were bound by a political agenda that we might recognize has some roots in Jewish social experience. But there was that. And then on the other hand, the other sort of extreme, the other provocative account for it would be that of William Klein, who says, there are two kinds of photographers. There's Jewish photography and Goyish photography, in the same way that there is black jazz and white jazz. An interesting analogy that I think does make its way into the content of some of the remarkable images in this book, but is also another way of thinking about what it is that Jewish photographers of the 20th century, and I'll just be a little more specific here. The photographers featured here, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure, are predominantly, and this is not going to work for everyone, but people born in the first quarter of the 20th century, came of age in the second quarter, and achieved whatever renown or commercial artistic success in the third quarter of the 20th century in New York, both as the site of their photographic production and typically as the setting for their images. So among the many questions that I think that an audience here at the Magnus will be interested in hearing about is your own reflections on the meaning of this remarkable, and I think to my experiences as a casual reader of the history of photography, an under-remarked convergence of ethnic identity or historical situatedness on the one hand, and a remarkable flourishing of black and white photography during what we might now see as the heyday of a certain kind of artistic practice. So with that, I just really want to stop talking and invite you to introduce this book, both to those of us who haven't had the pleasure yet and to those of us who have.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, those comments, David, are really what should we say, on point, right? In terms of photography and in terms of the issues around Jewishness. And I specifically made an effort to talk about photographers, right? The men and women who were taking the photographs, because as a social historian, I thought, this was a way of coming to understand what kinds of pictures they took and why they took those pictures. And I think dealing more abstractly with photography can sometimes be challenging in terms of trying to connect it with Jewishness, although I do make the argument that these photographs here constitute part of Jewish American culture. And, they should be embraced as such. I want to, along those lines, show a photograph not by a Jewish photographer, okay? Bernice Abbott.
This is Goyish photography.
Yeah. Okay. She came out of the Midwest, and she comes to New York, and then she leaves New York and she goes to Paris, and there she works in the atelier of Man Ray, another Jewish photographer, okay, Emanuel Rednitsky. And she comes back in 1929, having been really influenced by Auger's photographs of the city, which she brings with her. And Auger, as another non-Jewish photographer, brings with her, and she's struck by how much the city has changed. And so she embarks in the 1930s on a series of pictures of New York that's in part funded by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, in those years, and later put together in a volume called Changing New York. And this is a shot of the garment district. It's a shot of the garment district that is not how Jews experience the garment district, right? It's from way up high, right? It's looking down 7th Avenue. The garment district has now moved from the Lower East Side and Broadway up to what becomes known as the garment district, up to 7th, 8th Avenues, north of 23rd Street and below 42nd. And it's a beautiful photograph, right? But it's not the kind of photograph that most of these photographers felt represented New York. From their point of view, New York was not what you could see from tall buildings looking down. It was what you saw on the streets. And that's why this photograph is the photograph on the cover, right? Because this is a photograph taken by Morris Engel that in many ways represents what these Jewish photographers were like. Morris Engel, yes, you're right, child of immigrants, loses his father at an early age, grows up in Brooklyn, actually on Coney Island, discovers photography as a teenager. This was taken when he was 18. Right? And a lot of these photographers start out very young as teenagers or in their early 20s. And what he's showing you here is a complicated picture of what happens on the streets of New York. I'm just curious. You've all been to New York? Everybody here has been to New York. Okay, right. So this guy's going down the subway steps, right? And you also know in New York that men have the right to look at women, especially if you're a white man. And to make comments too. Okay, and women do not have the right to look at men. We'll see what happens when a woman gets a camera. That's different. That gives her a license to stare. But here you've got this woman, and she knows she's being looked at, right? Which is why she's looking straight forward and holding on to that box, which probably was a lingerie box. And she's ignoring him. And Engel is stationed there. Who knows exactly why? Maybe because the sign says eyes examined, right?
Or maybe because of the X-Lax.
Or maybe because of the X-Lax. That's right. I mean, both of those signs say New York in ways that he knew as somebody who walked the city. So it's not looking up, it's looking at people, and New York is about the circulation of gazes. And the fact, if all of you visited the city, you all know that if you can look at people, people can look at you. and that you are as much an object of other people's stares as you have the ability to stare at others. So, I don't know. Did you want to say anything about this one? Or
no? I mean, I love that you chose it for the cover because of Eyes Examined. I mean, this is maybe more my intellectual interest than some of yours, but this is a particular study of vision that is regimented by the command of signs that ostensibly have a commercial purpose, but when you put them in a photograph, they either serve as captions, as it does here, or they actually serve as commands. The canonical photographer that maybe this most resembles, I think, would be Walker Evans, whose own studies of signs also do that. Take signs and then by locating them centrally in a photograph, turns out to be an injunction to the viewer of the photograph.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to take us to another case of Eyes Examined. Here you've got to look closely because it's up in the corner there, right? And in this case, this is, and you don't see the whole thing. This is taken down on Hester Street on the Lower East Side. By Saul Leibson, who was one of the founders of the Photo League, along with Sid Grossman, in his early 20s. The two of them met at City College. So, you're getting a sense of the connectedness these photographers had. Both of them were left-wing. Sid probably, joined the Communist Party. I don't know if Leibson did. He may have also joined the party. In any case, they were left-wing, and they thought to take pictures of regular New Yorkers, ordinary New Yorkers. And this photograph is one of those great photographs where everybody's looking at something else. Something's happening there off stage, and they're on the different levels of the step. The only person who's really in focus is the woman, who was standing there with her arms closed in her house dress. And then up close, you get a sense of what happens when a photographer is on the street, which is to say that people turn and look at him, right? The boy is looking at him. This man over there is giving him a not very nice stare. The guy down coming up the steps is also looking at him, which makes this other man turn and look at him. So you get this whole sense of the circulation of gazes that occurs on the streets of the city. And the optometrist's shop lets us know, right, that this is a Jewish neighborhood because it's got Hebrew letters. I don't know if you can make it out very well, but there are Hebrew letters there, and a lot of Jews went into optometry. It was a good business. I mean, if you couldn't afford medical school, right, it allowed you to be a professional, but you were also self-employed. All the things that matter in those years. So there were lots and lots of these shops around in the city. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move us on to next one, which are games. So, yeah. So you want to say a little bit about these games?
Yeah. So I was actually first struck by the chalk games because it does seem on the surface to be one of these bird's eye views that is notably eschewed by most of the photographers featured in this book, but with a proximity both to the game itself and to the kids that makes it a street scene. So it's not formally the angle that defines the photographs that you've highlighted. It's something else. I do think it's intimacy, and it may be strange to say that that's an intimate portrait on the left, but it is. The portrait on the right is quite intimate. It's I mean, I'd love to hear your reading, but if you're curious as to what it looks like to at least one reader of your book, I'm very Sinistro-centric, so I draw into this because the batter is left-handed. But But it does seem to probably be an interracial stickball
Yes.
game.
Yep.
By which I don't just mean that there are people of multiple races, but that it's a black team against a white team, and then there's a Jewish butcher looking on. It's a very beautiful portrait of the batter in particular. I mean, that's almost a kind of a classical pose. And this is something that you point out in the book, so maybe it's obvious. But the streets here are not thoroughfares for the most part; they are stages, and that's true even when people are passing each other and gazing at one another. And it's certainly true when you're shown that cars in these images and in many of the images in the book are parked cars typically, even when they're doing a lot of work in the photo. And we may see a couple where the photo, if I remember correctly, that made it into the PowerPoint, where the car is doing some interesting visual work. They're almost never moving, and there are some technical reasons for that as well. But at the juxtaposition of the cars essentially on the periphery of the street and the kids in the center is making the point that these New York streets are stages rather than arteries for passage. So.
Yeah, I would add that Leipzig took the picture out his window, right, the one looking down. This is his street on Prospect Place, so that is part of the intimacy of the encounter. This is his home and his block. And these are the kids that he probably knew there. The stickball game is not necessarily his block, right? He's walking around a little bit in Brooklyn, and was part of a project that he gave himself to record children's games in the city. So he went around the city looking for all different kinds of children's games. He came a little bit older to the Photo League, and I probably should say a little something about the Photo League, because the Photo League was this place where these men and women met, and it was started in 1936 as an offshoot of something called the Film and Photo League, which existed in a lot of different cities and really goes back to Europe and Germany in the 1920s. So the one set up in New York had both film and photo, that is to say, motion pictures, as they called them, right? Moving pictures as well as still pictures. And then the two groups split. And the still picture folks become the Photo League, and Leibson and Grossman both were formative in saying, we want everyone to be able to take pictures, right? You don't need to be a professional. You can come and you can learn. They started run classes, but you can also criticize as all the people. Photography should be accessible to them. And that was a really important move, so that the professionals who had been part of the original Photo League end up leaving, because they wanted a co-op, right, that would allow them to, what Magnum eventually becomes, to market their photos around. And that's not what the New York Photo League was. So the New York Photo League was located on the second floor, 21st Street, north of Union Square, and it had darkroom space so that people could develop it, film together, and also printers. And so the process of taking photos and then developing them was something that was shared. It wasn't an isolated individual experience only. And I think that that's important, because that helped to shape what constituted a good photograph, what you should take pictures of, right? And that was discussed not just, once a print was made, but it was discussed in the darkroom as well. And this was a place where people had good times. Right? They had Friday night, parties, and they had lectures, and someone like Bernice Abbott was part of it. She gave lectures. Paul Strand was also part of it. The photo I showed you before, I'll just go back there. This one, Strand didn't like. He said it's two photos, right? You got the top one, which is very good, with the woman, right? And it's in focus. And then you got the bottom with these people that are not in focus, and they're interrupting it. And Leibson...
You didn't know the word photobomb.
No. That's right. And Leibson says, no, they're together, right? The picture needed this boy moving through, because that's what the texture of the city was like, and that's what I wanted. And the details of that are really what helps to make the photo. So, okay. So I want to move us on to this one, okay? So this is a photo taken by Sonia Handelman Meyer, and she grows up actually in Queens, New York at the time, and discovers the Photo League during World War II when not many men are there because most of the men get drafted into the war. And this is a photograph, as Ronnie pointed out, in the chapter that one of those verb chapters, they're all verb chapters, called Waiting, which I really like the idea. Because in New York, that's what a lot of people do. They wait. You wait for a bus, you wait for a train, you wait to meet people, you wait. And you wait on the street. And photographers, saw that. And I think it's valuable to also see how a woman photographer, what she chose to picture. So
yeah, no, I love the waiting chapter. It's maybe even my favorite chapter in the book. But I actually saw some differences between a number of the images show people absorbed in thought, and a lot of them reminded me, if any of you know maybe in some ways the most famous photographer featured in this book would be Robert Frank. Robert Frank's The Americans features lots of people who are absorbed in thought while waiting for something, and the photograph invites you to consider a range of emotional states. And a lot of the photographs here do that. This one is different because these are people absorbed in reading. Maybe it's my own preoccupation, but I like this photo sort of apart from the waiting issue, because they may not be waiting, they may just be ostentatiously reading in public space, posing as readers. This may be what they do, or maybe I'm just projecting because that is what I do. I read, and I prefer to read on airplanes and buses and cafes. I like to read in ostentatious self display. So I saw this as a woman photographer constructing a gaze of men who want to be looked at by women in the first place. Yeah. But anyway, no, there's a huge amount of text in this, and a lot of publicly visible text, and then these men are reading relatively small things rather than big newspapers. They're sort of seemingly withdrawing from the world of big text into a world of smaller text, but they are very much posed. I mean, the man on the right with the cool haircut seems especially posing, in all senses of that word.
Yeah.
Two.
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. One of the things that's so nice about looking again at these photographs together with someone is that you see other things, right? I spent a lot of time. There are 150 photos in the book, and I spent a lot of time with these photographs and thinking about them, and before writing about them. But okay.
Well, one thing I'm struck by, and thought about this, is that what you said earlier, which is that you are centrally interested in the photographers. I mean, you're a social historian, and you see the photographers as as a, sort of a social group with particular experiences and formation, and think about the decisions that they're making. And that's, I think, totally interesting and important way to do it. I realize that my instinct is always to imagine the viewers. I always think about, especially when photographs are taken of things that are visible to lots of other people, I sort of imagine, oh, well, this is part of some world of display. And there are many reasons why any two people will see different things in the photograph. But I'm wondering if that may even almost be like a disciplinary, methodological thing about social and cultural historians.
Okay. Which I think is relevant to this one, right?
This is great.
Yeah, it's a great one. So William Klein, you already quoted from him. Klein not only, took great photos, but he talked about them in a very Jewish style. Klein grew up in Harlem, actually, in New York, and then went into the military when he was 17, and was sent to Europe. And he ends up staying, and he uses the GI Bill to go to art school. He studies with Fernand Léger, and also he starts to take portraits, photographs of various parts of the city. And he gets his commission from Vogue to come back to New York to take photographs of New York. And so he's in New York, 1954, 55. And that's when he takes a bunch of photographs of the city. And this is one of them, right? And this one is part of the chapter on talking. And as a social historian, before we talk a little bit about this photo, let me just say that one of the things that I learned, which I did not know, as I was working on the book, was that roughly half of New Yorkers didn't have private phones around the time of World War II. They didn't have them. So if you wanted to have a conversation with someone, you had to leave your house, right? And meet that person somewhere, often on the street. So photographs of people having conversations is another thing that these photographers pictured. But then post-war, in the 50s, everybody gets private phones. And you start to get public phones that allow not to see a two-way conversation, but a one-way conversation, right? And this one was taken, I remember correctly, on 42nd Street, where it's in a cigar store, and Klein, says she was so absorbed that he took a bunch of photos of her, and she just kept, she completely ignored him. Right. So here, if you're thinking about people looking at it, right? I mean, she's being looked at, right?
Yeah, and it's amazing. I mean, the observation that you make that she's visible but not audible, I think, rhymes with lots of things that street photography does in general, just as a sort of almost like a generic feature, but things that were especially interesting to your photographers. This is an example of many things. One of them is the use of glass reflections to show, sometimes in a distorting way and sometimes in a more straightforwardly illuminating way, to show the scene, right? So rather than stand back and show many things, you just take a photograph of the glass. And it's a reminder that a lot of the experience of the visual experience of the cityscape in mid-20th century New York is refracted through the commercial glass. That's one thing, and then the car. The other thing that I like is the sort of taking of letters out, right? The mutation of signs. I'm maybe one of the few people here who grew up in New York in the age of the Electric Company, which was a very cool children's TV show that was largely, I would say, dedicated to showing kids that if you move letters around in public space, it can transform the world. So I looked at this. You offered before. I'll let you share. You're reading it. So it's a something phone, presumably the EPHO. But I look at this right away and I see an anagram for hope. And I think, oh, that's maybe the joke that he's making, but it sort of doesn't matter if it's intended or not. It's just it's just one of those photos that remind you that words and letters in public don't always do the bidding of their authors and exhibitors. They do what readers in the streets want them to do. And you're going to tell us about a different reading.
So another reading that was offered by a colleague of mine at Michigan, Sarah Blair, was playing with the Jewishness of it. And Klein, there's no question, Klein was a very Jewish photographer in many ways. That's why,
and Jewishly literate.
And Jewishly literate, that's right. Growing up in an Orthodox home. And so she reads this as Epho, which, for those of you who know Hebrew, means where, okay? And yeah, it could also be Epho, right? This photo. I mean, it's the title of it. And it captures, I think, the way in which Klein really wanted to convey New Yorkers, right? And he loved plate glass. He did a lot of plate glass photos.
Yeah, and I say I hadn't seen his photos before I read the book, and this is one of several photographers that I've been moved to now follow.
So, good.
Okay. You sold me on Klein.
Okay, great.
Well, Rebecca Lepkoff also.
Yes.
Sold me on. So, I don't know if you want to talk about her or not, because she's not in your PowerPoint.
I didn't bring PowerPoint of her, but I did bring Helen Levitt, and Levitt has, again, I would say, often since her death, gotten much more attention than she did certainly in the latter part of her life. She was really interested in photography and influenced, she says, by some of the well-known photographers at that time, like Walker Evans or Mexican photographer Bravo, or some of the other well-known photographers. She decided early on in the 30s to take photographs of kids. And I think that's partly because she was a woman. As a woman, although a camera gave women the license to stare, as I phrase, she also becomes somewhat invisible to kids. She's like another mother, another woman on the street, as it were. And so she can take pictures, and people don't particularly pay any attention to her. And that's certainly the case here, right? Where there's this mirror frame, and the mirror's just been broken. Right? And so she's taking photograph of these kids attempting to pick up the shards of glass, which is a rather dangerous occupation. But none of the adults on the street are really particularly concerned. Right? Kids played on the street all the time because the apartments were small and there was no room to play in an apartment. Apartments were for sleeping and for eating. That's what they were for. And the rest of the time, if you were a kid, you played on the street. And you went out, certainly started by the age of 6, without adult supervision. Some of these kids look a tiny bit younger than that. And I love this photo because of the way in which it also gives you the whole texture of the street and how people are interacting on the street, and the fact that this is probably an integrated neighborhood, which is why you have the black boy together with the white kids as well.
And Levitt in general shows integrated photos more than some of the other
That's
photographers,
correct.
I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. She is particularly conscious of black and white, and of showing them together, right? Rather than I mean, most play on the streets of the city was gendered. That was a distinction that was really clear. Girls played with girls, boys played with boys, as you see here. But it was integrated play at the time. The black population of New York in those years of the late 30s and early 40s was maybe 10%. Right.
That may be we're getting us toward some of the historical changes, but I'll bring that up again.
Okay.
If we have some of the later photos.
Okay. Okay. So let me move on here. Levitt. So here's one from the early 50s, is Stettner. Louis Stettner is someone like Klein who both grows up unlike Klein, Stettner grows up in Brooklyn, but like Klein lives part of the time in Paris and moves back and forth. And this photo of the guy waiting, right? Stettner gave the name "The Soul of New York," and I think he gave it that title in part because of how different it was from Paris. Now, I don't show any of the Paris photos, but that's my reading of this particular photograph. That to Stettner's view, by 1950s, and again, this is shaped by his politics, which was left-wing and all, a black man could sort of represent, yes, the soul of New York.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe we are getting to that. I just part the way my mind works. I think about Jewish New York in the 20th century in 4 different quarters, in quarter centuries, roughly, and I do see a transition in that's reflected in these photographs from the 40s to the 50s, and some of it is formal, and some of it I think is more just straightforwardly demographic. But there's not only a black protagonist in this photo, but there is a confrontation as well. There is the meeting of the gaze of a photographer, and it's somewhat hard gaze to read.
It is.
But I did notice, and maybe you're about to talk about this, in which case just cut me off. But there is a little bit of a trend in a number of the photographers that you look at toward more confrontational portraiture in the 50s. That's the formal feature. But there is also a historical context for this, that the encounter between Jews and others, and especially between Jews and black people, is in many ways the real story of the third quarter of the 20th century, of the Jewish New Yorkers' shifting position, greater confidence. I mean, the second quarter of the 20th century features the creolization of the Jewish New York population, because despite the very conspicuous presence of World War II era refugees, the immigration restriction of the 1920s means that the population is overwhelmingly American-born for the first time in the history of Eastern European migration. So that's what's happening. And the third quarter, and fueled by the GI Bill, et cetera, and the gradual relaxation of many of the forms of anti-Semitic restriction, including in the fashion photography world, that is part of the story, creates a different social political environment for New York Jews at the same time that New York is becoming a black and brown city. So it's hard for me not to sort of think about that every time I see it. And so to me, this seems like the beginning of the third quarter of the 20th century from your story, though, as I think you're going to show us, the confronting gaze of the portraited individual is an issue beyond just the Jews and non-Jews, right?
So here's an example of that. This is from an earlier chapter that shows photographs of Coney Island, and these two photographs were taken roughly a decade apart, and they do show different attitudes toward photographers. The Feinstein photograph, taken in 47, was invited. As Feinstein recalls, they said, "Hey, mister," right? He was on the beach with his camera. Take my picture, right? And so he does. He wades into this sort of group of teenagers, and you can see his shadow. I'm not sure if you can make it out, but in the book you can make out his shadow in the sunglass, right? Right?
One glass.
One glass.
I hadn't even noticed it.
Yeah. So you see Feinstein there, and it's a wonderful photograph of teenagers. Now Feinstein was a teenager himself. They probably were 17. Feinstein was 18 when he took this photograph. And at the same time, it also lets you recognize that the letting go that occurred on Coney Island, the freedom to take your clothes off, and just be out of the more formal New York that existed in those years, is something that the men do easily, the boys, men, and the woman does not. Right? She's got her radio, she's got her dress on, and she's lying on the sand. The other photo taken by Bruce Davidson when he was, I guess we would say embedded. I mean, that was his mode of taking photographs. He would, embed himself in a group. And in this case, this was a gang. It was a Catholic gang in Brooklyn. And he hung out with them and took all kinds of photos, including when they went to Coney Island. And you can see in this Coney Island photograph the look of the woman and the man, the boy, girl, however we're going to describe them. They're young, but it's not a, hey, take my photo. Right?
And it's not indifferent either.
Oh, no. Yeah, and they would have known him. Right? Because he wasn't a stranger the way Feinstein was walking up to this group of teenagers. So there really is a shift.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, one might make, I'm tempted maybe to make more of it than is warranted, but it does feel like Bruce Davidson, who's a little bit younger, Feinstein is also actually, but Bruce Davidson's a little bit younger.
He's even younger, yeah, and he comes from Chicago. He's not a New Yorker.
He's born in the 30s, I think.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, right, and he is very successful. So the Jewish photographer is now really the establishment, and the objects in his photography are not Jews.
Right.
So
yeah, that's right. So there's a great story about the Feinstein one that occurred later on. The photo did get published in Life magazine, and the a nephew of this woman saw the photo and wrote to Feinstein and said, she looks beautiful. She still looks beautiful today. Right? And it was, it was really a great sort of re-encounter that way. Okay, so we need to move on. Okay, Esther Bubbly. So Esther Bubbly also, like Bruce Davidson, did not grow up in New York. Right? She's, again, somewhat younger. She comes to New York in the 40s. She works very briefly with Stryker at the Office of War Information, and then when he leaves the Office of War Information, she comes to New York City to work on this Standard Oil project, right? That was supposed to make people like Standard Oil. Yeah. Right. Well, Standard Oil had, its politics, and selling oil to Nazi Germany was, they wanted to change the view. And photography was thought to be able to do that. So this is not a Standard Oil photo, but this is a photograph she takes in Times Square. And clearly, she's entranced by the lights, by the selling that's going on, by this charming guy who's selling hot chestnuts, which is still one of my favorites. Do you like hot chestnuts? Did you read?
I did as a kid.
Yeah, I really like
I haven't had a good one in a while.
Yeah, well, it's hard. And also by the Edge of Doom, right? The movie marquee behind her there. So, and Bubbly ends up making her life as in New York as a photojournalist. She has has a very successful career, as does Bruce Davidson. So we're sort of moving in a different direction. Yeah.
Yeah, and this does feel like a later photograph to me in some ways. But the interest in light and the interest in the relationship between reflected light and neon light and kinds of illumination seems like a more persistent preoccupation in New York photography, even going back to the period before you. But the faces are quite striking. I feel like that's it's odd to have these three faces actually dim the background lighting. Usually a photograph like this would make the people seem visually insignificant behind the marquee, and it's actually reversed here. So that's why I was struck by it.
Okay.
But again, the car is another example of where car is mirror rather than vehicle.
Right. Yeah. The car behind the man. Okay. So I think we'll conclude with Levitt. Okay. So this is a photograph. It's probably one of the photographs that has become something of a classic photograph of these four men, each of them looking a different direction, and the young girl peering out of the window. And you're getting here the freedom that the guys have on the street, and the girl is protectively inside, looking out. And it is in part a photograph of the neighborhood. It's in part a photograph of how Levitt engages with people, what she ends up seeing in the urban space. And I wanted to end with it because there's a photo that I couldn't include in the book because I couldn't get a high enough resolution, but I mentioned slightly, and that's this photograph. And I don't know whether this photograph came first, right? And Helen Levitt says, turn around, I want you around, and she directs what happens, or whether this photograph came second. And they turn back around, they say, okay, did you get it? Is it good? What do you think, right? The only person who's basically in the same position is the girl in the window watching it. And that's one of the, what should we say, both the frustrations and the opportunities of a photograph is that you can potentially imagine what's going on, right? You can imagine the dialogue.
But my question for you, though, is you chose one of them and one of these photos and not the other for your book, or constrained. You would have had both, okay.
I would have had both, but I couldn't get, the press wouldn't let me publish a lower resolution. I said we could make it smaller, but they would, no.
Okay, because I was going to say that if I had been your editor and you sent me both of these, I would have chosen the one that you chose. It really does fit your themes much. But this is a great photograph.
Yeah.
But the other one really fits your themes. Right. So Helen Levitt saw fit to take both and to exhibit both. But you, I think, maybe under some constraint, I think you chose the one that really captures the themes of this book so well.
Yeah. So. No, it's a great photograph, and it is one that lets you really appreciate the Jewish photographers of New York City, the street photographers there. So
should we open this up?
I think we should. Yeah.
Questions for the author.
Yeah.
Where do you want?
I think there's a mic.
Is a mic somewhere?
Yes.
Do you want to call people or?
Yeah.
I can just be the mic toter.
Right. Okay.
When you introduce yourselves and then ask.
Okay. Thanks.
Hi, Susan. I'm really interested in the concept of consent for these photographs and the photographers what's your sense of what type of consent they got taking these photos or didn't get? Like, especially that one of the people with the chestnuts scene. It's like they seem. It's like, is the photographer really close up, but they're not paying attention to the photographer? Are they using zooms? Are they talking like this other one? It's clearly, you seem to think that the photographer's in conversation with the subjects of the photograph. How did all of that, do we know how that all worked, and was it different by photographer?
Yes, so it was different by photographer. So some of the photographers would hang out at the same spot, day in, day out, right? They became sort of part of the scene, and they would take photographs. Other photographers asked people, could I take your photo? And usually the answer was yes, because most people didn't have cameras and stuff. And many of them made it a habit of bringing prints back to give to people when they took their photographs.
Do you want to share the story, though, about the man who called the police?
Oh, yes, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so Rebecca Lepkoff, and I didn't include any of her, so I'm sorry, was somebody who did hang around and took a photograph of a guy, and he was across the street, and he's furious at her. He sees her, and he comes back, and he wants her to give her the film in the camera.
He wasn't the object of
No, and she's
the tale, right?
Yeah, she says, oh, but you're only going to be like a little dot in the photo, right? And he doesn't care. He calls the police and, it tells the police about it. And the policeman looks at him and he says, hey, it's a free country. She can take the photograph. So, they did encounter people who didn't want their photos taken. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Paula. This has been really wonderful. I have a question that maybe is a little too obvious, but I'm really curious. Do you both have theories about why photography was so populated by Jews and why Jews were attracted?
This
to
was the
medium?
question I want to ask. So thank you for making it explicit.
Okay, yes, I have theories about it, and it's not just because they were left-wing. First of all, photography, people did not think of it particularly as an art form, right? It was mechanical, you had a camera, theoretically anybody could do it, right? I mean, we all have cameras now in our pockets or whatever with these phones. And so it was open. When photography gets invented in the 19th century, Jews go into it relatively early because it's also a business, right? They set up photo studios. And in Europe, not just, in the US. So it's a means of earning a living for people who set up photo studios, right? And lots of people would have their photos taken at special occasions, etc. For you have a baby or you have a wedding or that kind of thing. So there was that commercial aspect to it. What's different about these photographers is that they see the possibilities of photography as enabling their neighbors to understand the city and maybe make for social change. That's what's different about this kind of photography that these Jewish photographers were engaged in. They really did see it as interactive. They also, I have a nice quote from a photographer I didn't show you, a man named N.J. Jaffe, who becomes a photographer after World War II, after he's been in the infantry and stuff, and he doesn't know what to do with himself. And he becomes a photographer, and he starts taking pictures of people in Brownsville and street markets and stuff like that. And he said he saw photography as a way of giving dignity to these people and their lives, and at the same time giving dignity to himself. So these are all different reasons why Jews go into photography. And remember, of course, there are lots of different kinds of photography, right? There's fashion photography, and there's sports photography, and there's photojournalism, and there's, right? I mean, it's a rapidly expanding area in the 20th century.
But would you say, though, that some of those photographic professions are somewhat off limits to Jews, or harder to break into in the second quarter of the century than the third? I'm thinking especially of photojournalism and fashion photography, which are more WASP-dominated fields in mid-century than they would become later in the century.
That's true. I mean, but you do have Jews in photojournalism, right? I mean, you got your Robert Kappas, and you got Alfred Eisenstadt, and you've got, I could name other people who are in it. It's true that, Life magazine or Look magazine, they're not their main hires, but I mean, certainly by the 1950s. There are lots and lots of
right. By the 1950s, I was wondering whether that's a historical development. I don't know, but you're right. That you gave some good examples. So, I'm going to say one boring thing here, which is if you ask the question not why Jews were drawn to photography, but why so many of the street photographers of New York were Jewish. Almost 1/3 of the population of New York was Jewish in the second quarter of the 20th century. So you could just say these are New Yorkers.
Yep.
In the same way Naomi Rosenblum says, well, these are leftists. One could say, well, these are New Yorkers, right? No.
Right. You could.
Hi, Susan. My name is James. I'm a history major here at UC Berkeley. My question is the following. Considering the fact that photography is one of the most important art forms in human history, what has been the overall cultural impact of Jewish photography? Thank you.
Okay, so that's a hard question because a lot of these photographs, right, if we're talking photography, don't get, as it were, rediscovered within the realm of art until, certainly not until the 70s or 80s. So it doesn't happen at the time when they're being taken. Now, they show, at the Photo League, they showed exhibits, right? And later I talk about Limelight Cafe in Greenwich Village, which also had, photo exhibits. But there were relatively few spaces, aside from the Museum of Modern Art or Julian Levy's gallery, that showed photographs as art. It happens later, and by then, many of these people, well, a number of them die quite young, unfortunately, aren't doing it anymore. The women, when they have children, they give up doing photography. Helen Levitt never marries and she never has kids, so she continues to do photography throughout her life. The same with Esther Bubley.
And they're two of the most successful.
That's correct. But Vivian Cherry, Rebecca Lepkoff, Sonia Handelman-Meyer, I mean, so there are influences that lead to photography, this particular type of street photography not being recognized as art. And then, of course, there are other kinds of photography, right? So Paul Strand, who I have one photo by him in the book, but he does photography as art, right? Or Stieglitz does photography as art, and it's a very different kind of photography. Yeah.
Thank you, boss, for such a wonderful presentation. I was wondering, all those pictures and the photographers, have they left any notes? Nowadays we can look at the metadata in the pictures, figure out where it was taken. For example, the couple of pictures on the Coney Island, it's definitely a political statement in a way, because one is after the war and the other one into the Cold War. So have the photographers left anything in terms of their notes or commentaries about that? Thank you.
Yes, some of the photographers did. The photographers who lived longer lives recognized that their early work, right? Remember, I was telling you, sometimes they were teenagers when they're taking these pictures. So think back yourself. What do you save of what you've done as a teenager? But if they lived longer lives, they did take notes and organize their files and stuff like that. Others of them had kids. These are the men who had kids who organized their stuff, or spouses who organized their stuff. But for someone like a Sid Grossman, who dies young, there's very little information. Or a Dan Wiener, there's very little information. They die in their 40s. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to the cigar store photo of the, and you suggested it was staged. I just want to ask two questions about it. One is there was the words about men at work is above the reader there. Is that in contrast? But also, is there a woman's body in silhouette that's halfway on the right side of the picture? And that's just...
This here? Or
No, the woman standing.
The woman standing there.
Not a silhouette. It's actually.
This woman.
Yeah.
Who's looking
At the man in the Chesterfield ad.
and the man at the ad, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. What was the question?
What was the men at work above his head?
Right, men at work. Yeah.
Right.
The other reason it's staged is the woman staged there too.
Oh. That.
Well, she's certainly knowingly included. I mean, there's no way that that's not a photobomb, right?
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
I
And knowingly bisected.
Yeah. You know, I did not. I had a chance to interview Sonia Handelman-Meyer. She lived a long life. She lived to be 100. And so I asked her a lot of questions, but I didn't ask her that one. So I can't say whether there was another. You know, she was walking the streets with another woman kind of thing, or whether there's another photo in the book, which is not in the PowerPoint, that shows the same shop, but with a man standing over next to the Chesterfield ad, and, you know, slightly different arrangement, right, of the...
I when I look at the woman, I think it's significant that she is represented as moving, even though she's like stationary at the time. They are fixtures. Right. And she is more a shopper. So they are part of the spectacle, and she's a spectator.
I would think, looking at her foot, that, yes, she's walking, right, from the way the heel is shaped. Right, she's not actually facing me.
Hi, I wonder if you could go back to that Helen Levitt photo at the end. There's something I really want to point out. It's so... I don't know if people are aware that during the war you had a certain amount of material you could use to make clothes. And so the way that women's suits were designed, you can see sometimes if you look at the clothes from that era, you'll see that the fabric, if there was a stripe or a plaid, this was really what made the garment very interesting, because the amount of material was rationed. So here I want to really point out how this photograph captures, from the jacket to the trousers, that you see the dark continuing along his body. You know, this is so amazing to capture that. And also the way somebody put themselves together to be out on the street, that you had an outfit, a hat, a tie, even the cigarette. You know, you just didn't schlep along. You really put yourself together when you went out of the house. That's my comment.
Yes, thank you. There were definitely dress codes in New York City in those years, and yeah, he is particularly elegantly attired with that stripe suit and the tie and the hat, the whole bit.
Hi, good to see both of you.
See you.
So I am curious about technology. So we've been talking a lot about the photographer, and we've been talking, David brought up the cars and the plate glass windows. I'm wondering, within your research, Professor Dash Moore, about the photographers themselves, did they think about their cameras as their tools, as accessories? Did they, depending on maybe their gender, did they utilize those in different ways to access different spaces in different ways? And I'm thinking, especially even with the Helen Levitt photos here and the one earlier, like she's stared at by women in all of these, and how much was a woman conspicuous holding a camera in a way that a man might not have been, or how technology might have kind of impacted that movement through the streets.
Okay, so the technology is changing in the 30s. Some of them use Voigtlander camera, which is a large box-shaped camera. Usually you would want a tripod for it to keep it steady. The lighter cameras, like the Leica or Contact, that come in allow for much more flexibility. Someone like Klein in the 50s starts to use wide-angle lenses. He really goes crazy with the wide-angle lens. He likes that a lot because of what it does with the scene. The Rolleiflex was a very popular camera. It was smaller, and someone like Engel liked it a lot because you could hold it and you could look like this, and the camera would be pointing over there, and you just glance and you're taking a picture there, but people think that you're actually, looking right. And so the cameras did have different, elements to them that people liked and preferred for one reason or another. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amy. Thank you for this talk. My question is if you came across any or many photographs of street festivals, because a lot of what you've shown
There is one here, a big one. I'll let you.
Oh,
you want to talk about San?
The San Gennaro Festival becomes a popular site that these photographers visit repeatedly. So I have a cluster of those photographs, some by Sid Grossman, some by Dan Wiener, also by Louis Forer. And that's down on the Italian Lower East Side. Mulberry Street. Yeah. And they're taken. Some of them are taken daytime. Some of them are taken at night. There's a variety. Yeah.
Getting back to Helen Levitt, I'm a big fan of Helen Levitt, and I have images of hers in my home, and I've been always looked at them now a little bit differently because I read once, and I'm wondering if you've read this at any time, and it goes to the technology question that just came up, that she used a right-angle lens at times. Yeah. And particularly when she was photographing children. It was her, and so you see the difference, particularly when she's photographing children, because if you photograph children on the street, they're often coming right at you. They want to know what's going on and all that. So at that time in the photography magazines and the ads in the back, you could buy these right angle lenses. I tried using them once and it wasn't very successful, but she apparently carried with her a lens so that she could look this way and photograph that way. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't diminish the photographs in my mind, but it explains them a bit more.
Yeah, I have heard that too, and I just, what can I say? I don't know for sure, right? I mean, there are some people who have argued that, yes, she used that, as Ben Shahn also used a right-angle lens. So Ben Shahn is a painter, but also a photographer. I've also read people who said, no, she didn't. So it's like, I'm neutral on that. I don't have evidence one way or the other of what she did.
With regard to the question of why the Jews, a line from Bellow's Adventures of Augie March, which is around this time, occurs to me, which is when he says about himself, the hero, I was a sort of Columbus of the near at hand. And seems to me there was a special allure for Jews leaving a traditionally parochial life that was lived within the Jewish community, and now they were in a city that offered them geographic and other freedoms to explore other communities. And I've also long been fascinated by the French Jewish banker, Albert Kahn, who paid for the archives of the planet, kind of an incredible utopian project that he undertook. And he believed, obviously, that photography could unite the whole world in a kind of brotherhood without homogenizing everyone. Everyone was captured in their distinctive dress and customs. So I think there is a utopian universalism aspect to it, and also this Columbus near at hand thing.
Those are very lovely reflections. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that they are quite relevant. Most of the photographers did not bother to take pictures of the neighborhoods in which they grew up.
And there's very little Jewish content in these photographs apart from signage.
Right.
For example, there's Catholic street festivals. There isn't representations of Jewish religious life or Jewish rites of passage or even Jewish social life. Even though some of the people in the photographs are probably Jews, but it's really only signage that lets you know that this is a city of 2 million Jews.
Right.
Hello. I think photography can be deceptive or maybe at least difficult to work with because it looks so real. But as we've discussed, often it's staged. And often we don't know when it is staged or when it isn't. So how do you work with that challenge?
That's a question for you, not for me.
What?
That's a question for you, not me. I would give a different answer because anyway.
Go ahead.
I would say, work with toward what purpose? Right? In other words, is Professor Dash Moore presenting this as what New York looked like in mid-20th century? I would say no. I don't think she is. I think she's presenting from the perspective of photographers. So the more it's staged, the more it's cropped, the more it's maybe even distorted, the more valuable it is for her purposes. But I mean, do you want to talk about how one could use this as a transparent window onto New York life or New York experience?
Yeah. Okay. I don't think it's a transparent window. That's okay. And I think that you're right. Photography does seem very real to us when we look at it. And yet, of course, behind every photograph is a photographer who makes a decision, to shoot that particular moment, and then makes another decision to develop the film, and then makes the third decision to print something. So there are these stages of decision making that photographers go through in thinking about how to produce a photograph. Now, I do talk about what Photo League photographers wanted from their photos, right? They said that they should be straight photos, by which they meant you should use natural light, right, rather than artificial light, and you shouldn't crop those photos. They should be the full thing. And that was their theory of the right kind of photographs to take. And so I let you know in reading the book that that's what they argued were the basis of their photographs. Now, not everybody in the book is a Photo League photographer, but
not all the Photo League photographers adhere to
that. Is correct, and not all the Photo League. That is correct. Yeah. But they're well aware of the fact that photography is, as you said, made up of choices. That's how I would put it, rather than it being staged or deceptive. It's made up of choices.
And the choices are valuable rather than being obstacles.
Right.
In some ways, it's about those choices.
Yeah. Okay. Are we running out of time?
One last question, and
Okay.
then we'll be able to go to, we'll finish up and have a chance for
Okay.
Thank you so much for your comments. In the eyes of these photographers, what's changing about urban life in New York?
I think it depends on the photographer, because. So what happens to the Photo League? In 1951, it closes. Why does it close? Because in 1947, it's put on the Attorney General's list as a communist organization. It wasn't a communist organization, but there were communists who were members of the Photo League. And Grossman especially is attacked by a woman who had joined, and she gives testimony and names him and stuff like that. The photographers connected with the League become much more wary of taking photographs. Someone like Lisette Model, who was a refugee who arrives in 1938 and who is in the book, coming from Paris, says in the 1950s, I didn't know what I could take a picture of. She was really nervous about being followed, of having the photos that she took somehow incriminating her. Certainly, since she was a recent citizen, this was very nerve-wracking. Grossman stopped taking photos of the streets, and he started taking photographs of up in Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard stuff. It was a complicated moment, so you can't just say, how do their photographs change? Because those who were involved and who were political were really sensitive to what was happening. So some of those photographers go into fashion, right? Because they couldn't care less in fashion whether you had been a communist or not. Right? You took photographs. That was not relevant. Other photographers, really switch what it is they do, so that in a sense, the street photography, as the book moves across the decades, certainly in the 1950s, you're seeing photographs by different photographers than you were seeing from the 40s and the 30s.
But they don't actually have an opportunity to do what would be fascinating, which is to reflect on the way.
Yeah.
There's a kind of weird white flight of the photographers from this subject matter in the 60s and 70s.
That's right. They become very nervous about it because of the political associations with it. Yeah.
All right, I'd like to thank both Deborah Dash Moore and David Henkin for this fascinating conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us here today.